Why, hello there. This is Sister Service, and today with me is my good friend Dan Ellsworth. Hi, Dan.
Hey,
So,
how are
Dan,
you?
good. So, tell us a little bit about you and what we're going to talk about today.
Okay. I live in Virginia with my wife and two girls, and I do consulting for a living. That's consulting in project management and technology kind of fields. And I graduated from BYU, and I'm living down here in Central Virginia near Charlottesville, and very much love it. And I also devote a significant amount of time to the Uplift Community of Faith, which most of your listeners have probably heard of.
Hmm.
Um, and also, I'm a contributing writer to Public Square magazine, which is one of my favorite venues for reading articles on Latter-day Saint thinking on contemporary issues.
Oh, that is awesome. Well, we're so happy to have you chatting with us today on this. So today we're going to talk a little bit about conversion and what it is, what it isn't, and why that's important for us to understand this mystery surrounding conversion. So why don't you lay us a little story here of why this is so important to you?
So, okay, there are some examples of things that we see in the news and even in our interactions at church and in other places that illustrate this concept of conversion. And we usually talk about it in Christianity in a religious sense of being converted to Christ and being converted to the gospel and these kinds of things, but we often don't really dive into what exactly that means. And
Right.
it's easy to actually mistake other things for conversion,
Right? Yeah.
unfortunately. And it's a concept that is very, very consequential. Okay,
Right.
it's a big deal, and the better that we can understand it, the better we understand ourselves and the people around us, and can interact with them in ways that are healthy and appropriate. So
Right.
you, if we were to go into a concrete example of where this concept comes into play, I would point to, so right now it's May 2020, and
Right.
just a few months ago, we had a situation with the Honor Code office at Brigham Young University
Right.
where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that owns the university had put forward some guidance on to its Honor Code office on LGBT relationships and things like that. And in the
Mm-hmm.
past, there was very clear language around prohibition of same-sex activities, romance, and dating and forms of physical expression and things like that. And we so it was very clear where the Honor Code office at BYU stood on those issues, and eventually there was some language put forward that was more general,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people at
Right.
BYU took that to mean that, oh, the church is coming around
Right.
on
Right.
LGBT issues, is just kind of embracing uh,
The
kind
rest.
of progressive
Yes.
ideas about LGBT issues, right?
Right.
So, and that caused a huge controversy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there were members of the church and people at the university who had made some pretty big decisions in response to that more vague guidance.
Right.
They were celebrating, and it caused it caused a lot of people to think that, hey, the church is moving in a particular direction,
Right.
and we're so happy about it, and it's going to ease the frustrations of so many people.
Right.
And so when the church, there was, after that, Roseanne, you might remember, more guidance came down that was
clarified
very specific again.
Realized that it wasn't quite what they
Yes.
thought.
Right. A clarification came down. And that caused a tremendous amount of frustration.
Right. So many people upset.
And yeah. And there were people on campus shouting at each other, protesting each other's protests.
Right.
All of these kinds of
big
things.
Displays.
Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So it turned out to be just this huge disaster for a lot of people. It did. And
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and it was clear because those who were really upset were not able to be converted to the beliefs of the church, and they found themselves in what's diametrically opposed to these changes, right? So they were not converted, and therefore they missed out on being able to understand why decisions ended up being the way they were.
Right. And this is what we saw was there's a reality that was put on display in this situation. Right. And the reality is not everybody at BYU is personally converted to the church's teachings on gender and sexuality.
Right.
There are BYU faculty who are not converted to the church's teachings on gender and sexuality.
And so that almost kind of brings us back to trying to even understand what conversion is, because in some ways I'm sure they would try to refute that and say, well, I'm converted, but it's clear that you're not lining up in the same pattern of thought. And so maybe we ought to tackle briefly what conversion really is defined.
Right. So that's just kind of a real life example to sort of set the stage and help us understand why this concept is important and what it looks like in real life. Well, let's talk about definitions now. And one of the challenges that we have in the church among those of us who are working to minister to people in faith crisis, people who are struggling in their faith, is something that we hear a lot is, I lost my faith, and I was one of those people who did everything right. I always kept the commandments. I served a mission. I was elders quorum president or a bishop or whatever, Relief Society president, and they usually rattle off some callings they've had. And so I did all of these things, and I put in the time and the effort, and then, I don't understand how, I could find out about difficult parts of church history and all of these other things, and then, how I feel like what I was doing was wrong, and da-da-da. So that list that's kind of the resume that people put forward, that is often what they're doing is they're telling you how enthusiastic they were, how committed they were.
Right.
And I get that. I really, a lot of us have been there. We've enthusiastically complied with the church's teachings, with things that we've been taught and things that we've been asked to do.
Right.
Those things, that enthusiasm, that zeal, that compliance, that intensity, that kind of the team mentality, the esprit de corps of this is my group, this is my people, this is my faith community. None of those things are conversion. Exactly. You can have all of those things 100% and still not be converted to Christ and converted to the the restored gospel.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the word itself even just implies change. And unless there is some type of change, I always think of the opposite of conversion as compulsion in some ways. And being forced to change is not what we're talking about. We're talking about just conversion as a changing entity inside yourself, right? So I can't imagine that it's anything else. It could encompass our zeal and intensity, but it's really that change. That what is I wanted to say, Richard Rohr called it the identity transplant, which I thought was kind of interesting,
Yeah. So Richard Rohr, he's a Catholic theologian. He has some really, really great teachings on conversion. And we'll talk about some of those as we go along. One of my very, very favorite General Conference talks was given in October 2000, and this is Elder Dallin H. Oakes gave a talk on becoming. And I kind of remembered it over the years as being a good talk, but I stumbled across it just a few weeks ago and took it for a spin. And now it is one of my all-time favorite talks ever given in General Conference. I think it's one of the greatest of all time. And I'm going to read just a passage from it to where he gives some examples of what we're talking about, trying to contrast zeal and intensity with conversion. They're not the same thing.
No.
But he uses the example of Peter. He says, the Savior confirmed the importance of being converted, even for those with a testimony of the truth. Okay? So starting there, he's saying, you may have a testimony, a personal conviction of the gospel and still not be converted to it.
Right,
okay?
Right, yeah.
He says, in the sublime instructions given at the Last Supper, he told Simon Peter, I have prayed for thee that thy faith fail not, and when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. In order to strengthen his brethren, to nourish and lead the flock of God, this man who had followed Jesus for 3 years, who had been given the authority of the holy apostleship, who had been a valiant teacher and testifier of the Christian gospel, and whose testimony had caused the master to declare him blessed, still had to be converted.
Wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
So let's pause the talk right there.
Still have to
follow.
Go ahead.
Yeah, he still had to be converted. He dropped everything to follow Jesus and had been just this incredibly devoted and intense follower of Christ for 3 years. And here we're being told that he's not yet converted.
Isn't that amazing? What does that tell us about it? Is obviously not just only today I feel like being converted to your gospel and you jump right in. There's that teaching, that learning that has to occur.
Right.
So I'm excited to hear what you have on this.
Well, so Elder Oakes, he continues and he takes a turn that is a little bit ominous. But I think you, Roseanne, knowing what I know of you and your personal story, this is going to resonate with you, okay?
All right, let's have it.
He says, our needed conversions are often achieved more readily by suffering and adversity than by comfort and tranquility. Many of us experience some measure of what the scriptures call the furnace of affliction. And he he says the refinement and sanctification that we need, it's possible through those experiences.
Oh, so true.
So
for me, that's really powerful for prayer. There's a lot of people I talk to that don't have this great understanding and belief that in prayer. And after everything that I've been through, I just feel so on fire about that subject, about how important prayer is, simply because through suffering and adversity and that furnace of affliction, all of a sudden, I see its power, and it was made clear.
Yeah.
And so, I 100% with you on this one.
Yeah. So it's not something that you can earn. Right. By compliance, by zeal, by, compulsion, checking the boxes,
yep,
and looking good at church and all of these things,
right.
That Latter-day Saints
Dan, are you trying to say we can't just show up? Dang it.
Yeah, it's all of these things that that we often consider the mark of, quote, a good Latter-day Saint, unquote, right?
Yeah.
Just dedication and zeal and intensity. Those things are not conversion. Conversion is when your whole perspective on the world is transformed.
Yes.
And you see yourself in a different way. You see other people in a different way. And there's no going back to who you were before. Mm-hmm. Something has happened that has broken apart these things that you have built, right. And you don't plan to rebuild because you don't want those little things back anymore. These little things that you build to impress yourself, impress others, impress the church.
Right.
That comes through adversity, through situations where you really
are trying.
That you've what was that?
I was just saying, that you are tried. In fact, in some ways, I would almost say undone, because sometimes it's almost like you are literally broken apart to stubble, and then then it's like this new creature, which is funny because you always hear people talk about conversion as you're a new creature in Christ, and it only makes sense now that I've been brought that low and rebuilt several times. So
right.
I totally understand.
Right. So Roseanne, you're using different vocabulary now. Okay?
Right.
This word undone, that's vocabulary of conversion. Broken down, that is vocabulary of conversion. It's different from earning, achieving, intense, meeting the mark, right. Impressing. It's different language. Broken down, undone. Surrender is a word of conversion.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Probably the hardest words I've ever said is thy will be done. I don't know if I've ever said any harder words in my life. So.
Right. Those are words of conversion. Those are, and conversion just has a different vocabulary than this vocabulary of earning and impressing and meeting and achieving and all of those kinds of things. It's very, very different. And when someone is converted to something, okay, they are interacting with someone who is not converted to that thing, it's very hard to see eye to eye. Right. It's very hard to kind of reach each other when you are converted to something and somebody else is not converted.
Yeah, it's almost like two different levels of education, trying to bridge that gap without the education. It's sometimes all but impossible.
Right. So it is. And that's, I'm going to read a quote now from a guy named Thomas Kuhn, and he's a historian of science, okay? we've been talking in religious terms, but conversion it has a really good kind of analogy in the hard sciences, even in, biology, chemistry, physics, and what we call the hard sciences. He wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he talked about how in science, scientists need to be converted. And he calls that a paradigm shift in his book. But the language is still the same. People have to have their world very fundamentally disrupted, if they're going to be able to embrace new ways of thinking. So he says, Thomas Kuhn, he says, in a sense that I am unable to explicate further, the proponents of competing paradigms practice their trades in different worlds. Okay, so he's saying scientists who have different paradigms, they might both be biologists,
right?
But if they're operating from competing paradigms, competing views of the world, then, he says they practice their trades in different worlds. And he reads off a whole bunch of scientific points of view where people don't see eye to eye. He says, one contains constrained bodies that fall slowly, the other pendulums that repeat their motions again and again. In one, solutions are compounds, in the other, mixtures. One is embedded in a flat, the other in a curved matrix of space. Right. So that's all like really wonky scientific language, right?
Right. But it's just
but he says, viewpoint. He says, practicing in different worlds, the two groups of scientists see different things when they look from the same point in the same direction. Okay? So these are groups of people right in the same place, looking at the same things, and just do not see eye to eye.
So you could even say that this maybe is like one scientist who believes in God and another one that believes in no God, and maybe, so there's that's what he means by different viewpoints, right? That they have different premises of how they view the world. Is that, or even just what matters as important to them? Okay.
So you're starting to use some personal language. Okay, what's important to them personally.
Right.
And that's the key here, Roseanne, is even scientists. Let's say you're a scientist and you have you enter a PhD program and you have a mentor, and that mentor teaches you a particular approach to chemistry, all right? And you spend years working with this individual and publishing papers and co-authoring articles and books and all of these kinds of things. Your families go on vacations together, okay?
Yeah.
And then you graduate and you go off on your own, and your mentor is back at the university where you were. And let's say some of the theories that you and your mentor used in all of that research and all of those things, some of those theories are now starting to be abandoned by the scientific community. How well is that going to go for you and for your mentor? Let's say your mentor is a guy who's like 70 years old. This is the only way he's ever done science.
Oh, goodness.
And, is he going to change his mind in the light of new scientific approaches?
Yeah.
And
maybe not.
And then you're in a position where you have to say, gosh, do I abandon my old paradigm that I developed at this institution that I love, around people I love, and things like that? So Thomas Kuhn, he says that is why a law that cannot even be demonstrated to one group of scientists may occasionally seem intuitively obvious to another.
Right.
Saying scientists sometimes they just cannot see eye to eye at all. Things that are obvious to one group are just impossible to another group.
Right.
So, and then I'll give you one more Kuhn sentence. He says, before they can hope to communicate fully, one group or the other must experience the conversion, there's our word, the conversion that we have been calling a paradigm shift. So think about how this applies to our politics.
Right.
I hate abortion. I think abortion is a horrible thing.
Right.
But I know people, and I have friends who are not converted to that point of view. So if I were to engage in online debates with them, how would that go?
I think there's a lot of people who believe that you can literally, through compulsion and good points, you could just talk that person right into your beliefs. Dan, are you trying to say that is not going to work out? I thought this whole time.
It is not going to work out.
No, it's just not. You know, the day that sunk in and hit me, I was like, I felt such relief. I no longer wanted to get online and, go back and forth with people politically. It was like, oh, there isn't a way that you can grab people and immediately make them understand what you understand. And I had to give a lot of my trust over to God in that area. Like, you'll work this out. These are the details of life. I'm sure you'll work this out for that person. And I no longer felt the need to fight and to get in the brawl. And that was such a relief.
Right. And the thing is, Roseanne, when you make a decision like that, people who don't understand this concept might call you,
spineless.
Not committed.
Yes.
Or, spineless. Where's your backbone? Why aren't you yelling at people with me?
Right. Get committed. And it's just like, oh man, committed has so many different definitions. And I don't know if I want some of those. So. Right.
Committed is not converted.
Yeah.
And if somebody is not converted to the idea, going back to the subject of abortion, converted to the idea that there's something sacred about that process of gestation of a human life in a mother's womb, even if it doesn't always go the way that we hope it to, even if there are biological processes that can be really frustrating and sad, in that whole process sometimes.
Right. Yes.
If you're converted to the idea that there's something really sacred and holy about that process and that we need to, really
approach it in a reverent
not
manner.
Interfere.
Yeah.
Right. Treat it with reverence. Yeah. So reverence is language of conversion. It's hard to treat something with reverence if you're not converted. Right. And
I mean, I was just going to say really quickly, because there's so many people who will always come up with wonderful points on abortion and like, well, what about the 11-year-old that somebody, got pregnant, or there's all of these things, but they can all be addressed once we've realized we have reverence for life. And now we can start to look at each of those scenarios in the proper reverence, right? So,
Right. So, and that, even situations like that where you have people pointing out exceptions to a principle or whatever. Right. Well, even those kinds of situations require conversion to underlying principles.
Yeah.
And, in our faith, our church has taken a position on abortion that is a little bit nuanced, compared to some Christian organizations and Christian
That are
groups.
hardline. Yeah.
And right, because there are multiple principles at work in this issue. And when you're converted to multiple principles, you get this kind of nuanced, okay, we need to balance these things against these things. They're all important, and we're converted to them all, right? So that's how conversion works. And when conversion is absent, you have people online just talking past each other, yelling at each other, not reaching each other, because they're not converted to the principles that each other are converted to.
And so Dan, I would ask, what do you now do when you think that you should all be converted to the same principles because we all attend the same church, and yet we go to church and now we're still having issues with those we co-mingle with and those we have to work with? Because we see this a lot. We see people unable to, even though we're all in the same sort of belief system, we're not yet all on the same levels of conversion in a billion different areas, not even just in the faith itself, but even in smaller aspects of the faith, the more complex issues that arise. And how might we try to engage this? Because this is a very difficult thing, you know. You should believe the same thing I believe because we're all in this church together, right?
Right.
That's the idea that people have. But
yeah, and I'll say I consider myself to be deeply, deeply converted to a fairly orthodox view of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm a believer. I'm converted to the institution's historical narratives. I'm converted to the teachings, the commandments, if you will, the system as a whole. I'm converted to it. I don't have any illusions that any of those things are perfect or without flaws, but I think they are worthy of my, converted devotion, right? And however, I've had times in my life where that wasn't the case.
Right.
And so, I've had times where I've grown disillusioned and deconverted, and just kind of been in a state of confusion and gosh, is this worth my devotion and that level of conversion? And so
in that particular area,
it's not
right.
Yeah, and so that's an important concept. It's not something that happens once and it's permanent.
Yes.
But once you have experienced it, you can't be the same. You can always point back to a time when, you know what, I was deeply converted at one point. I wasn't just checking the boxes, fitting in, trying to impress others around me, just belonging to this community. There was a point where I was deeply converted and experiencing this system and these concepts on such a personal level. And again, we can fall out of conversion. It's not something you can have an initial experience, kind of a Paul on the road to Damascus experience that's so jarring,
right,
that it then allows you to develop your conversion, but that experience is not your conversion.
Right.
So a conversion is something that is very gradual, takes a long time. I'm experiencing it on a regular basis now. There are, it seems like almost every week there's some light bulb that goes on.
Yes.
In my heart, in my soul, and I am putting away a belief I used to have, or a way of thinking that I used to have, in favor of, a better, a revealed, a better understanding of a truth. So,
Right.
it's a gradual process.
It is. And I think as we interact with other people who may not have already had some of the experiences or the conversions that we have, because in some ways I feel like it's not just one big conversion, it's a million conversions to certain aspects of knowledge that we're gaining. And as we interact with people who may not have had that happen to them, the word long suffering comes up in my mind over and over. Like it's just one of those things that you have to understand, that as you interact with other people, there has to be some level within you that has to have some long suffering so that you can just realize the importance of unity and moving forward rather than haggling over every detail and causing you and other people pain.
Yeah.
And,
Absolutely right.
I just find that happens a lot for women in the church. You'll have somebody who has so much that they have to give. They're older, maybe they've got a lot of knowledge, and a lot of conversions are happening there versus when someone's younger and they don't always know exactly what those principles are. And then there's moments of pushback. And if that older, wiser person could only just for a second realize that the answer lies in not hammering, but in conversion, and let the Spirit work on that, let their patience be filled with long suffering, all of a sudden you come and you've changed your role from being a teacher, your role of being a hammer, like you will do it this way because it's the right way, to a teacher. And that's the idea. I hope that everybody understands that conversion and really immersing yourself in conversion makes you a teacher. It doesn't make you anything else, in my opinion. What do you think, Dan?
I think you're exactly right. And I think somebody who, so in the gospel, in our interactions with other people, we would do well to consider ourselves facilitators of conversion.
Oh, that's perfect. That's even better than teacher, really.
Yeah, and we can't force it. Okay,
Right.
I'll give you an example, and this might sound shocking to some people, but when the proclamation on the family first came out, I just didn't like it. Mm-hmm. I didn't like it for probably the first 15 years of its existence. It made me uncomfortable. Uh-huh. I shouldn't say it made me uncomfortable. That implies that it had some kind of power over me.
Right. You felt uncomfortable.
I couldn't really process it in a healthy way. I was not converted to the proclamation on the family. Mm-hmm. Every time I would read it or listen to people talk about it, I had in my mind, going through my mind, oh, but what about this? What about this exception? Yeah, but that doesn't apply to these people or those people. Just constantly picking it apart. Right. And I wasn't converted to it. And years ago, I just started to listen, and I realized that like this was a huge problem for me, a huge part of why I was struggling mm-hmm. in the church, right? Mm-hmm. And I prayed and I said, something has to change here. Either this document needs to be revised or my heart needs to be revised. Mm-hmm. and when we talk about our heart, we're going back into Old Testament language where mm-hmm. Ezekiel talks about how the Lord will replace our stony heart with a heart of flesh. Mm-hmm. And Jeremiah talks about having God's word written upon our hearts. Yes. And, this, or God's law, I should say. Mm-hmm. Like, why would law be written on your heart? Like, do this and don't do that. Why would that kind of stuff be written on your heart? but Jeremiah says, that is part of God's intentions for us. And so the proclamation on the family, it just was not written on my heart at all. For me, it was a source of frustration. But over time, when I really decided to listen and pray and fast and listen some more and listen some more, there came a day, and I can't actually pinpoint the day, but there came a day where it was just like, oh, I get it. I get it now. I didn't get it yesterday, but today I get it. Yeah. And it was that now I can say I am fully converted to the proclamation on the family.
You said something there when you were talking about over time, and that just hit me. I was like, I think there is a lot to say. A lot of people might even think that conversion could happen in an instant, but more often than not, it's that gradual developing, right? And it actually reminds me of this little quote that I had here from Richard Rohr, where he was talking about the development of Christ. And he was saying basically that he grew in wisdom, age, and grace. But then he says the entire biblical revelation involves gradually developing a very different consciousness, a recreated self, and eventually a full identity transplant or identity realization. And that's kind of what you're saying here, isn't it? There's this slow transplant, this identity realization. Kind of like
and there are big processes that kind of like just these leaps in insight that we can experience here and there, but
bolt of the blue.
Usually it really is over time. So I had a turning point with the proclamation on the family.
Oh, yeah.
And I just began to perceive it in a different way. And over time, after that, line upon line, that proclamation has been written on my heart. It's part of my soul now, which is crazy, because for 15 years or so, I was like, just keep this thing away from me, right?
Right.
And so, but now I look at it and it's the only framework that makes sense to me anymore.
Yeah.
Even accounting for all the exceptions and situational factors. But Richard Rohr, I love he's probably one of the greatest teachers on this subject of conversion. And he says, you can only transform people to the degree that you have been transformed. You can only lead others as far as you yourself have gone. You have no ability to affirm or to communicate to another person that they are good or special until you know it strongly yourself.
Yes.
Okay? And that is language of conversion. And like you said, I mean, you might have somebody at church who's frustrated that somebody else doesn't understand the value of a gospel concept, and you might have elders quorum shouting matches over these kinds of things. But our job is not to shout people down. It's not to. It's not to. Okay, I'm going to argue this point so persuasively that you're not even going to have a choice but to submit to my superior argument, right?
Yeah. Well,
that's not what it is.
It even happens. It even happens within the realms of administering in the gospel. You've got, so obviously I've spent the last, 5.5 years in stake primary within 2 stakes. And as we're talking with women, listening to the struggles that they deal with, you would often hear things about unity happening that were just kind of falling apart for them, and they couldn't get along with other people, and nobody's listening to their leadership, or nobody's bothering to communicate with them in certain ways. And in many ways, they just were having these interpersonal struggles, not realizing that these struggles are part of the gospel learning. They're part of your conversion. And we accidentally miss the conversion altogether because we're so immersed in these are their problems and these are their problems. But what do we bring to the table, that could make a difference? And so all of a sudden we're talking about conversion within ourselves is the answer, and finding unity within ourselves is the answer, and allowing people the blessing of failing sometimes without controlling them.
Yes.
There's all these
Roseanne,
things.
Roseanne, you're speaking the language. Okay. It's a different vocabulary though, isn't it?
It is. It's so very much, it's less control, I think, in some ways, and that's scary for people. It's a vulnerability.
Absolutely.
It's making yourself wide open. And Richard Rohr always talks about, Christ and God, going through us, and it's this openness, right?
Right.
I love this.
So, yeah, and when we think about it that way, okay, yeah. So think about a time when you have been converted to a gospel principle, and someone else has helped that process along. It probably was not something that they said to you. It was probably much more about who they are.
Yes.
Right?
And if I was
conversion,
ready. I mean, honestly, if I was ready, I think that's another big key. Yeah. It's who they are, and was I ready? And if those two things meet together, rainbows and butterflies, right?
Yeah. If somebody is really angry about the proclamation on the family, my job is not to shout them down or argue them into the ground on this, okay? If I were to sit down with somebody and they were, if somebody said, Dan, help me understand why you feel okay with the proclamation on the family. I would want to hear their point of view. Where are they? Why, what are their pain points? What are their frustrations with it? And I could probably look at that person and say, that you are me 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
I could probably say that, but if that person, and you made this amazing point, if that person is not ready to take a step in a different direction, then we're very limited in what I can do in that conversation. Right?
Yes, amen.
I'm not going to try to convert that person. I'm not going to try to, even persuade them. I can, if they don't see in me something that they want, they're not going to come around. Exactly.
And that's okay that we wait until people are ready. I mean, I used to get upset when I would hear the quotes from Isaiah or from Paul, I believe, in the New Testament, talking about let their ears be fat, let their hearts be shut, and let them not hear until, unless they're going to be converted. And I was like, what? Why would you ever say, let people be dumb and sit in ignorance? It was because they just weren't ready.
So, yes, Roseanne, you and I have talked about this before. That's from Isaiah 6, and it's also quoted in Mark 4 in the New Testament. But it's this language of part of Isaiah's, what he was told from the Lord was to actually contribute to people not understanding his message. Because they just, if the preparedness is not there, then they're not going to be converted. And converted is the goal. Right. Okay? Right. It's not just like being able to give my intellectual assent to an idea. Conversion is the goal.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that really substitutes for it. Compliance looks like conversion sometimes.
Looks like it, right.
Yeah, enthusiasm looks like it, but
like
it's
it.
not.
It's just
That's not conversion.
No.
So, anyway.
I love it. Well,
But I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a very powerful passage in Isaiah 6, verses 9 through 10. It's one of these really kind of core scriptural passages that frames our thinking on what conversion is.
Well, I had to throw in Isaiah because I know how much you love him. And of course I do too. And I am so grateful for you to take some time out of your busy day to chat with me on this subject. We could probably easily go another hour on it, but I really am appreciative of your time. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave us with?
No, I think just a minute ago, I conveyed the most important thought, I think, and that is conversion is the goal.
Yes.
Okay? It's the goal. We can't force it. We can't make it happen. It's a matter of time and preparedness and a lot of other things. You simply can't force it or fake it.
Right.
So anyway, but I just hope that people understand that without it, you get a lot of the interactions that we have online and in other places that are frustration and people not seeing eye to eye and so forth.
And hopefully this powerful thought will sink into parents when you find that your children don't agree with certain things, or maybe your child has left the gospel. The power of conversion is peace. That you have peace, that it can eventually happen for other people like it happened for you, so in some ways you're able to sit back until someone's ready. And it's kind of nice.
You know what, Roseanne? I'm so glad. I know we're over time.
It's fine.
You just hit a very important point. If somebody has a family member or a loved one, a child who is not embracing the gospel, the very best thing that you can do is actually not to argue with that person or try to, all of these things that we've been talking about. The best thing that you can do is model what conversion is, that surrender and listening and openness and learning and patience and all of those kinds of things, that vocabulary of conversion, because it's so different from the modes of engagement that people, online and in various places, that how they engage with ideas and other people.
Right.
If you can model it, you will stand out, and somebody will see that, right?
Yes. It's very apparent to other people when you have finally achieved that level of understanding. And it's tough to hold on to, but it is very apparent. And then all of a sudden you become a person people can talk to and confide in and talk to when they're ready. So
yes. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for being willing to chat with me today here. And hopefully we will have you on as a guest in the future.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Roseanne.
Thanks.